Okay, guys, today we're going to finish up our introduction to World War II and take part two of our note session, which is entitled Intro to World War II. Now, by this time in our lessons, you should have a real good idea about all the causes that led up to World War II. We talked in our last lesson about the aggression that the Japanese had showed Italy, and then obviously the Germans. We talked about why and answered a very important question: why the Western democracies were just allowing them to do this, and why the world was allowing them to do this. And you learned a very important word. That was the policy of appeasement. And then you saw how the Hitler and Mussolini, if the British and the French weren't going to do anything, then Hitler was just going to continue to take territory. And that's what we finished with the other day on our lesson. Now, the very last thing that we talked about was this Nazi-Soviet pact. And it was obviously an event. It was obviously a document that is going to shock the world. And inevitably, the Western democracies are doomed, because what this did, remember, it basically shut down the Eastern Front if war were to ever break out. Now, the other day, we finished with Hitler taking territories, and we saw a little pattern forming there. Now, as you're looking at the map that I just referred back to, you can see that first off, he took the Rhineland, which was to the western part of Germany. He took the southern border with Austria. He took the Sudetenland, and then remember, after the winter months and after the Munich conference, he took all of Czechoslovakia. Now, as you see the pattern forming when we left the other day, you should have a real good understanding of where he was going next. So obviously, the next possible place would be Poland. Now, all great events in history that we've talked about have to have an immediate cause. You know, the American Revolution was caused by the immediate cause was the battles of Lexington and Concord and all the intrigue and Paul Revere's ride and all those fun stories. We talked about the French Revolution this semester and how the storming of the Bastille and the great story behind the storming of the Bastille. World War I, is going to start with a very, very memorable event with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary by that young teenager Gavrilo Princip. And all these great events have these great immediate causes, and the immediate cause of World War II will be the invasion of Poland. The invasion of Poland. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler is going to continue the trend of taking territory around his borders, and he will take Poland. This is the immediate cause of World War II. So melodramatic. Not a lot of drama here, just the Germans waltzing into Poland, and that's how World War II is going to start. Now, the reason why is a couple days later, here are your first declarations of war in World War II. The French and the British had no choice. They could not appease anymore. They could not give in to German aggression, and they had to declare war on Germany. So we'll see how the alliance structure is going to play out, similar to how it did in World War I. And by September 3rd, 1939, it was official that World War II is going to start. You can see Hitler there in Poland. You can see the New York Times front page. You can see exactly what happened there, and it starts with a map of Germany and Poland and so on. At this point, I want you to sneak away for the first time. I want you to watch the good video on the invasion of Poland. I want you to answer the question there and come back to the note session and continue with this note session as soon as you are finished. Now, invasion of Poland marks basically Hitler continuing to make advances, and that's what we mean by Axis advances. He's going to move eventually all over Europe. Now, the reason why that the Germans were able to take territory in such a short amount of time had to do with a battle plan that they had to do with a strategy. And that strategy is something that you might have heard of before. It's called Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg means lightning war. It is how these early places were taken, all right? And it's how these early battles were basically fought. And let me tell you something, there weren't that many battles fought. It was basically the Germans dominating all of Europe and any army that was sent out to them, okay? So Blitzkrieg is a fast-paced type of war that the Germans were improving, all right? They had superiority in the air. We're going to learn first and get introduced to their airplanes in their Air Force, which was called the German Luftwaffe. Airplanes made their debut in World War I, and they were first used for observation, flying over the trenches and preparing for an enemy advance. Early on, you can imagine this visual. Pilots were actually throwing rocks out of planes into the folks below in the trenches. Eventually, nations started to put machine guns on planes, but the first models, the machine guns actually took out the wings, and those planes fell. By World War II, the Germans had improved their planes tremendously, and their German Luftwaffe, their Air Force, had air superiority over everyone. In fact, remember the question about Poland that you'll see today has to do with where was Hitler when all this was going on? He was in a vehicle, and the answer to that will be a plane. Now, look at the tanks that the Germans had. Now, the Treaty of Versailles said that the Germans were not allowed to make any more of this stuff. Well, those are all the different types of tanks that the Germans had at World War II, okay? So obviously that gives a lot of proof to the Germans not listening to anything that the Treaty of Versailles had to offer. You can see down at the bottom left these huge artillery guns, these huge guns that would shoot these huge shells that we'll look at a little bit closer. And roads and railroads had improved in Europe by this time. So the bottom right picture shows how German soldiers were loaded on trucks, all right? They didn't have to walk to battlefields anymore. They were moved very rapidly to battlefronts and to countries and to places. And that also adds to the Germans being able to take a lot of territory in a short amount of time. Now, here's Poland, all right? So poor Poland. My Polish friends in the crowd, I'm so sorry. Poland fell in about a month, okay? And it's going to divide. So according to the Nazi-Soviet pact, remember, there was going to be a line. So you can see the line, and you can see the German arrows moving from Germany into Poland, and then you can see the Soviets moving into Poland. Now, the Germans obviously were going to take the west, and the Soviets were going to take the east. Now, a little side story here, we're going to get to the Holocaust, in a few weeks, and the majority of the German death camps that you guys learned about, Auschwitz and a few others, they're going to be formed in the western part of Poland, which is another direct result of the Nazi-Soviet pact and the invasion of Poland. So by September of 1939, all of Poland basically was invaded and partitioned, which means divided. And you can see the line on that map, the division between the Germans and the Soviets. Now, the winter came there of 1939, and there wasn't a lot of fighting. And the reason why there's not a lot of fighting during winter months is because it's cold. It's cold in this area of the world. If you've ever been to Europe at the winter time, it's cold. It's really cold. Machine guns and weaponry don't work. Motors and engines of vehicles freeze up. They don't work. So you don't really see too much fighting. So in fact, there was all this build up to war, but when the winter of 1939 and 1940 hit, some reporters referred to it as a phony war. It wasn't happening. It was phony. There was no fighting, and it was quiet. Well, when the winter of 1939 and 1940 subsided, well, Hitler's going to go back to work. And by April to May of 1940, look at the territories that Hitler will take in 1 month. Not one country in 1 month. 4 countries fall to the Axis powers and to Germany by May of 1940. So on the map, you can see right along the border, you can see Denmark, you can see the Netherlands, you can see Belgium, and then you can see Norway to the north, okay? So in a matter of not even a month, he's able to take 4 countries, and that's because of his quick-paced, lightning type of war. So as you're looking on that map, you can see that, the Germans have taken Poland, they have taken everything to their northwest border and their northern border, and basically knowing that there is no eastern front, the Germans can continue to go west. And guess what country is doomed? It's France. And we know that France is in no way, shape, or frame of mind or order ready to fight in another war. So there's a real famous event in World War II that was personified by a recent film out in movies that many of you watched called Dunkirk. Now, as the Germans were advancing into France, the British and the French were outside of Paris and were getting ready to meet the Germans. However, you can see in the diagram to the top, there were German infantry divisions that were flying through. That little black cross-looking thing is a symbol of the German army. Now, the German army surrounded the British and surrounded some French and literally are going to chase them north to the coast, right there in the English Channel. So where you see the city of Dunkirk and where you see the English Channel, well, just north of the English Channel, that's England. So there's really not that big of a distance between England and France, northeastern France, from that point on the map. So the miracle at Dunkirk was one of my favorite events because there were British troops that were literally cornered, literally trapped. Hundreds of thousands of British troops were trapped at Dunkirk. You can see the pictures up to the right. You can see the pictures in the images on this slide, which tell you exactly what was going on there. So imagine these hundreds of thousands of British troops on the coast, there close to the city of Dunkirk, and you have these German infantry divisions flying right through them. Now, the British did something, and we're going to stop and watch a film on this in a second, a real quick little film. They're going to send any able vessel, any vessel, whether it was a rowboat, a tugboat, across the English Channel. The shipping industry of England, those people shut down everything that they were doing and came across the English Channel from May 27th to June 4th. And the reason why it's called a miracle at Dunkirk, because of the hundreds of thousands of troops that were trapped and cornered there, there was actually 340,000 British troops that were saved. Now, if those British troops were taken by the Germans, World War II would have gone a lot differently for the British, okay? If they would have lost that force, the Germans could possibly have invaded the British mainland, which never did a German soldier step foot in Britain. We'll talk about an air war that was fought there, but I'll tell you what, the major effect of this and the reason why it was a miracle is that these men were saved, and if they weren't, it would have been very, very devastating for the British Army and obviously the French. I want you to stop for a second. I want you to go watch a quick little animated video on Dunkirk. It's one of those that we've seen before, and they do a real good job of telling you the specifics about this little event. Come back to me when you're done. Okay, now, by June 22nd of 1940, with the British forces shipped back to Britain during that miracle of Dunkirk, that left a freeway, just a highway, for the German army to ride right into downtown Paris. And on June 22nd, 1940, France is going to fall. When I mean France is going to fall, France will be occupied by Germans for another 4 years in this war. When I mean occupied, you can see the troops marching into Paris. The German troops literally took up shack and lived within the homes of these French people. That's what we mean by being occupied. So for 4 years during World War II, close to it, the French people were occupied by Germany. Now, there's some iconic pictures. You can see in the top left there, you can see Hitler and some of his head honchos. They're right in front of the Eiffel Tower. Down at the bottom right, you can see an image that I actually was on a prior lesson during our storming of the Bastille lesson. That was an image that I gave you when I explained what Bastille Day was, the French Independence Day, the main road in Paris there. You can see to the left in 1940, those are German soldiers in the same exact spot, riding down the same exact street, getting ready to occupy France. So by this time, you can pretty much see that all of Europe, by June 22nd of 1940, basically belongs to Germany and the Axis powers. Now, the Axis powers, as we're finishing up, did not just stop there in Europe, okay? So over the next year, the Germans are going to go, and the Axis armies, and the Italians and the Germans, are going to go to Africa. Now, we already talked to you about why Africa was so important. Now, we did our geography assignment. I told you to label the countries there in Africa, and you're going to see that those northern African countries had oil. That's what Hitler wanted, okay? So Italy, with the help of the Germans, are going to move into North Africa and secure oil fields, especially in Libya, and made Libya a member of the Axis powers. Now, this is a time where we're actually going to get introduced to Erwin Rommel. His nickname throughout the war was Desert Fox. He was one of the greatest tank commanders in the history of the world. So you guys that have been playing some tank battles and video games in North Africa, his name probably was mentioned. Now, he's also going to be known, as the war goes along, as one of Hitler's most trusted generals. In fact, he's going to be in charge of defending the northern French border later on in the war, because he was a trusted general and one of the greatest military commanders in the history of our world. So we got not just the Germans and the Axis powers taking up all of Europe, they're also moving into North Africa. So they're going to take Libya, they're going to make Libya, as I said a second ago, an Axis power, and then they're going to move the British, who obviously through imperialism was a protectorate of Egypt. There were British troops in Egypt, You can just see that the Germans are going to move them all the way back into Egypt, and there's going to be a famous battle fought there close to the Nile River, which we'll talk about in a short amount of time in our future lessons. Okay, so basically at this point, all of Europe was taken, all of basically North Africa was taken pretty much by Hitler, by Mussolini, by the Axis powers. Make sure that you remember it's to secure those oil fields. Now, by 1941, Hitler is going to look to the southeast part of Europe. He's going to take Greece, he's going to take Yugoslavia, he's going to take Bulgaria, and he's going to take Hungary. Okay, so on this map, you can see a really, really good understanding of who the Axis powers were, and more importantly, a couple years into this war, and remember, there's not a lot of fighting back here, all right? It's them literally just taking territory. You can see that a year into this war, pretty much a little bit over a year, you can see in purple the extent of the Axis powers' control in Europe, and it is a big chunk of territory. So refer back to this map whenever you need to, because it does a really, really good job of showing you, the early alliances and who was in charge of what as the war got going. Now to finish up, I just want to set up the early alliances for you, okay? So once again, we have our Axis powers. We're going to have Germany, we're going to have Italy, and we're going to have Japan. And then North Africa, obviously meaning Libya and so on. The Allied powers at the beginning of this war are Great Britain, France, Northwest Africa. Morocco was a member of the Allied powers from the start when the fighting just got going. And then the Soviet Union will still be considered an Allied power, even though they are not fighting the Germans and there is no Eastern Front at this time, okay? So as soon as you get done writing those, just make sure that you have your videos watched of Poland, make sure you have watched the Dunkirk video, and make sure you have watched the video on France falling, and answer those questions that are associated with those little short videos in the comments section of Shobi.